Great, so thank you all for coming this evening. My name is Dr. Caroline Copeland, and I am a lecturer here at St. George's in Neuropharmacology. So neuroscience to do with the brain, and pharmacology is the study of drugs action on the brain. Study of drug action. So neuro plus pharmacology is drugs that act on the brain. So study drugs is a specialty of mine. Well, not a specialty, but sorry, I need to be careful how I say that. Is a special interest of mine. So, have you tried a study drug? So Julian has just asked you, and a large proportion of you have either taken a study drug or are willing to take one. And it might surprise you, actually, that I can almost guarantee that almost everybody in this room has actually had, at some point in their life, a version of a study drug. And actually, some of you might be having a study drug right now. And that is because one of the earliest and most commonly used study drugs is caffeine, which can be found in coffee or in some soft drinks such as Coca-Cola. So that might be a little bit surprising to some of you. And also, it's actually in some flu medications. So have you ever seen medications like this where you have like the day tablet and the night tablet, and you've wondered what's been in them? So the day tablet often has either caffeine or another compound called ephedrine, both stimulants that wake you up a little bit more to make you more attentive if you're feeling a bit ill. So in addition to caffeine, which is a natural study drug, which probably a lot of you have had, if not everybody, there is another naturally occurring study drug, which there might be fewer of you in the audience that have tried this one. But cocaine is a natural study drug. And believe it or not, it was originally included in the original Coca-Cola recipe. At very small volumes and amounts, so trace amounts, but it was sold. Are you tired? Then drink Coca-Cola. I also found out whilst doing this that 7-Up used to have lithium in it as well. So if you wanted an upper day, you could have your Coke, and if you wanted to sort of have a chill-out day, you could have your 7-Up. So, the Victorians really had it sorted in a way, I suppose. And then another commonly used study drug, not quite so much in this region of the world, but in Arabic and African regions, chat or cart, it's a leaf that is chewed and spat out, also contains stimulant-like effects. So these are the naturally occurring study drugs, I suppose you could think. But what we're really talking about today is some more recent synthetic compounds. So I just wanted to break down for some people who might not know what a study drug is, as to what are the compounds then that we're going to be talking about today. So if you look online at the dictionary, a study drug is a compound that increases concentration and stamina. And that's two key aspects here. And also, the study drugs that we're talking today about are either used improperly by people who are prescribed them, or, as is more often the case nowadays, obtained illegally by those that haven't been prescribed them to achieve enhanced concentration and stamina. Now, study drugs fall under another category of drugs, sort of more of an umbrella term, which is a neurotropic. And neurotropic compounds improve cognitive function in healthy individuals. And so these are the types of compounds that we're going to be talking about today. So, what are these prescription stimulants? And some of them might be familiar in their names to you. Strattera, Ritalin, and Adderall. Ritalin and Adderall probably might be ringing some bells in your brain. And that's because those the top three of these drugs are often prescribed to people who suffer from attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And if we look back at the definition of a study drug, what they do is they enhance concentration. And in this demographic of people, what they need is something that enhances their concentration. So you can see why they're used to treat that condition. The other one is modafinil, which together with Adderall and Ritalin can be prescribed for sleep disorders, such as narcolepsy, which is when people fall asleep spontaneously, or hypersomnolence, which is excessive daytime sleepiness. And again, if we look at the definition of a study drug, it increases stamina. So in these people that are very sleepy a lot of the time, having a compound that they can take to enhance their stamina is going to be able to help them out as well. So an important difference to really think about when we're looking at these prescription stimulants is that they are prescribed for people already. So they must have passed various safety tests and gone through the clinical trials to make sure that they are safe for human consumption, and that is indeed the case, they are prescribed. But a key important point is the reason why these drugs are being used. So in people who have these disorders, what they are trying to do is restore their abnormal function up to a normal level. And the people that are abusing these drugs, who are already at a normal level of function, are trying to enhance their ability for either concentration or stamina past normal levels. And we're going to hear today about whether or not this could be, a good thing. Are we, enhancing ourselves? But is it cheating? Is it a bit like drug doping in sport, but drug doping for exams? So we'll have a listen about those differences from our speakers later on. Okay, and finally, I'm just going to go into a little bit of the pharmacology, because that's what I am, and I can't resist telling you about how drugs work. Don't worry, it's not going to be too much. So the top three, the Strattera, the Ritalin, and the Adderall, they all increase a chemical that naturally occurs in our brains called noradrenaline. Noradrenaline is very important in the fight or flight response. So if you're being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, maybe that is, yeah. You have to decide whether or not you're going to fight it or run away. And in addition to doing things like increasing blood pressure and heart rate so you're ready to fight or run, it also enhances concentration and decision-making skills as to what your actions will be in that situation. The other naturally occurring chemical in our brain is a chemical called dopamine that both Ritalin and Adderall also increase. And this increases our motivation. I was trying my best to find a picture that best described motivation. And looking at the demographic of people today, you probably don't know who Mr. Motivator is. But he was a aerobics instructor on morning TV who would get the nation moving and motivated in the morning. And that's what dopamine, there's many roles that dopamine have in our brain, but one of them is that it increases our motivation. So that's how, Strattera, Ritalin, and Adderall work. But what about this bottom one, modafinil? And this is being increasingly prescribed in the UK and, globally now. But we don't really know how it works. We think it maybe works some way in increasing dopamine and noradrenaline, but it could also help by targeting histamine receptors in our brains. So you have your antihistamine medications. Do you remember you have non-drowsy and then the drowsy ones? That's because in our peripheral parts of our bodies, histamine mediates our allergic reactions, whereas centrally, histamine is important for consciousness and staying awake. And so the drowsy medications for antihistamines enter our brains and make us sleepy, whereas the non-drowsy ones stay out of our brains and just deal with the allergic reaction that it's meant to be targeting. So modafinil might be entering our brains and stopping our histamine receptors from working as well, and therefore enhancing consciousness and our ability to stay awake. But we're not quite sure, which, I don't know, as a pharmacologist, I kind of like to know how the drugs work. Okay, so I think that's enough from me. I hope that's given you an overview of how these work. So I'd like to introduce the three speakers that we've got for you today. We've got Professor Ray Hill, who is the chair of the technical committee for the Advisory Council for the Misuse of Drugs. And this is a government committee that advises policy about pharmacology medications and whether or not they should be used and the laws surrounding them. Next up, we've got Dr. Alistair Jennings, who's going to talk about the benefits of study drugs, or the perceived benefits of them. And finally, we've got St. George's alumnus to welcome back, Neil Gilbride, who is going to talk to us about the use of study drugs in school children and why they are being driven to make this as a choice. Okay, thank you. So I'd like to pass over to Ray. You just click the coffee cup at the end. And that's something. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Still warm. Okay, so I'm going to try and give you a framework for why drugs should be legally controlled to help you with your thinking for the rest of the evening. And this slide is just to remind me that I'm talking from my base at Imperial College, and I'm not an official spokesman of the Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs tonight, so don't attribute anything I'm going to say to the Council. So why control access to medicines and drugs? Well, most of you are probably too young to remember things like thalidomide, but the main reason for having restriction on the sale and availability of medicines is because of dreadful things that have happened in the past. And in the United States in the 1930s, a lot of adulterated drugs were freely available, some diluted with things like antifreeze, and a lot of people died due to these unregulated medicines. And so as a result of that, the Food and Drug Authority, known as the FDA, was set up in the United States. We were relatively unregulated in this country until the 50s and 60s, and then the thalidomide tragedy, where a drug that was supposedly completely safe and could be given to help with problems like not being able to sleep and nausea in pregnancy, produced fetal abnormalities in a whole generation of children. And so as a result of that, what we now call the Medicines and Healthcare Devices Regulatory Authority, or MHRA, was set up in this country, and so there are very strict questions asked about any drug before it's allowed to be prescribed or sold. So that's the first take-home message. We need some sort of legal controls. Oh, wrong button. Now what have I done? Okay.
So just use that one.
That one. Okay. So the situation is now much more complicated because virtually every sort of chemical you would want to lay your hands on, whether or not it's a medicine, is freely available if you just enter the name of it in Google. And you'll find a website somewhere that will sell it to you, perhaps on the basis it's a research chemical and it'll arrive labelled not for human consumption, but nevertheless you'll have searched elsewhere on Google and found that in fact this is a great thing to help your concentration and help you pass your exams. So be very, very careful. Now most of the things that are available on the open web will actually turn out to be what it says on the tin. Doesn't mean they're safe. There's no such thing as a safe medicine, a safe chemical. And by and large, the sort of quantities that you would find in a tablet of a registered medicine, very, very difficult to weigh out. I mean, some of these websites are so helpful, they'll even sell you a chemical balance as well, so you can weigh out the tiny amounts you need. But it is a slippery slope, and it is very difficult. So do get hold of the message that these things are regulated for good reasons, and people are not just trying to stop you having fun. People die because they take too much of things that in other circumstances could actually be helpful medicines. And so it's important, as Caroline inferred, that you demonstrate what the safe doses of medicine is, and before you prescribe it to people, you actually can establish a risk-benefit ratio. So there are many drugs that do helpful things, but the side effects are so bad that, in fact, the risk-benefit analysis argues against them being used. And obviously, you would use a drug for treating cancer where it's a life or death decision. You could argue that whether or not you get good marks in your GCSEs is not actually a life and death decision. So risks are different according to what it is you're trying to do. And by and large, because you're not doing it with anybody else's advice, you have to accept that self-administered drugs are likely to carry more risks than those drugs which are prescribed for you or which you're taking because, say, a pharmacist or a nurse has advised you that they might be helpful. So that's just by way of introduction. So this is a slide given to me by Barbara Sahakian from Cambridge, who's one of the world experts in understanding of these drugs, how they work, what they do in people. And because she's known to be an expert, she gets lots of students in Cambridge turning up and asking her whether they should take them or not. And in particular, one of the drugs that's been around for quite some time now, methylphenidate, the prescription rate of that's gone up enormously in the last 10 years, whereas the number of young people who actually suffer from ADHD, which Caroline told you about, probably is about constant. So if lots more of these things are being prescribed, the chances are they're being prescribed for conditions where perhaps we ought to be rather cautious about their use. So another cautionary note. So what about legislation? Now, the Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs, which I sit on, was set up as part of the provisions of the Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971. And the idea was that the government would have an expert but independent committee to advise them on which drugs should be legally controlled and which shouldn't. And so the most harmful drugs, or the ones which are thought to be most harmful, are covered by this Act. And the classification within the Act is twofold. The drugs are put in a class from A down to C, and that's related to the perceived harms that the drugs can cause. And so in Class A, we have things like heroin and crack cocaine. Everybody would agree they're pretty harmful things. And also there's a whole set of legal penalties associated with illicit possession. Now, obviously, heroin is used as a drug. If it's prescribed for you because you have severe pain, then you don't get sent to prison. But if you're found carrying a kilogram of the stuff in the boot of your car, then you might well get sent to prison. So it's a dilemma sometimes that things which are useful medicines in one context can actually be drugs which are misused in another. And so if we move down to the second classification, Class B, these are drugs which are seen as a little bit less harmful, but still need quite stringent legal controls. And so amphetamines, which particularly in the form of methamphetamine, is the world's most abused drug. There's a report just come out from the United Nations showing that use of amphetamines is all over the world now. It's the drug most likely to be abused, and it is the drug most likely to cause problems, including actually causing your death. And the last year that figures were recorded by the United Nations, something like 7,000 people died in the United States as a direct result of misusing amphetamines. So methylphenidate, one of the drugs we're talking about tonight, is in that same legal class as amphetamines for good reasons. So that's just something for you to think about. Now, some of the other drugs down at the bottom are outside the misuse of drug regulations. And I should just say a little bit about schedules in the Act. The only things that are really important is that drugs that are in Schedule 1 are the ones that generally are perceived not to have any medicinal use. A good example would be LSD. So you can do experiments on it, including giving it to people to see what the effects are on conditions like depression, but you need a license from the Home Office to do that because it's not seen as a registered medicine at the moment. Drugs in Schedule 2 are ones which are seen as useful medicines, and so amphetamine, methylphenidate are used medicinally, but under checks and balances You can't have repeat prescriptions. They have to be stored in a particular way. Anybody dispensing them or prescribing them has to keep records of what they've done. Below the Misuse of Drugs Act, we have another act called the Medicines Act that covers things like prescription-only medicines, things which can only be sold by pharmacies, or things which are on what's called the general sale list. So these are things like small packs of paracetamol that you can buy from a garage, for example. But prescription-only medicines include some of the drugs we're talking about tonight. So atomoxetine, modafinil are in that class of drugs that Caroline was talking about. You could argue, if you were cynical, the only reason that they're in the prescription-only medicine list rather than scheduled under the Misuse of Drugs Act is because they've been around for a shorter period of time and we don't fully understand all the properties of those drugs and all the problems they could cause. And I'll give you another example. Tramadol is an analgesic that I've spent a lot of time thinking about over the last 10 years. It was seen as a better drug than morphine, a better drug than codeine, with fewer side effects. It was allowed to be prescribed as just a prescription-only medicine, and it became a very, very serious cause of drug misuse and addiction. And so a couple of years ago, it was rescheduled, and it's now in Schedule 3 of the Misuse of Drugs Act. So don't feel that those things which seem to have lower levels of legal control are necessarily going to be much safer if you're giving them to yourself without them being prescribed for you. It may just be that we don't know as much about them. Okay, so to try and pull all this together. Most of the drugs that we're talking about as study drugs are stimulants. They can have serious side effects. The mechanisms vary in details, as Caroline told you, but by and large, they're not a million miles away from amphetamine, methamphetamine, which are major drugs of abuse. The use of amphetamines started in wartime. Bomber pilots used to be given large doses of amphetamine, sent off to fly over Germany to drop bombs. It was thought to be a great thing to keep you awake all night on these long missions. No real problems, no side effects. And then they found after a couple of these trips, pilots were crashing. They were completely useless for a week when they got the rebound from the stimulus of the stimulant. And because of their mechanism working by releasing dopamine, they turned out to be addictive because morphine releases dopamine, and that's probably the reason that morphine's addictive. So drugs that initially thought to be safe may not be when you know more about them. And as I've said before, methamphetamine, the latest report from the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime tells us that this is the most widespread abused drug all over the world. Now, another thing is drugs given by inappropriate routes. One of the factors that we see on the internet now is they say, well, methylphenidate, Schedule 2 substance. Can't have that. Now, ethylphenidate, which is a very close analogue, wasn't covered by the Misuse of Drugs Act until we found out about it and introduced the legislation to do that. And so this became a street drug in Scotland. People in Scotland started injecting this substance intravenously. It killed a lot of people in Edinburgh and Glasgow. And it was brought to the attention of ACMD by Police Scotland, and we were able to put legal controls in place. And it wasn't just the fact that this was a powerful stimulant, it was that these people who were using it were people who were intravenous drug abusers who were used to using things like heroin. And when they were given this stimulant substance, they injected it the same way, and it stopped their heart. So it's not just about the drug, it's the way you use it, the route you administer it. So even drugs that we know are safe are used clinically, if used inappropriately, can be very dangerous. And I've said before, the newer drugs, we know less about them. And so I'll leave you with that last question that Caroline mentioned. You know, the World Anti-Doping Association bans all of the drugs on this study drug list as being inappropriate for use in athletics. It's cheating if you use a stimulant before you go out and run 100 meters. So why should it be used in people who are taking examinations? And in fact, some American universities, I think the first one was Duke University in Carolina, already consider the use to be cheating, and if you're found to be taking study drugs when you take your university examinations, you may well be failed. So I shall leave you with that thought, and I will click on the coffee cup, hopefully. No? Didn't go? No? It's okay. Too complicated for me. Very good. Okay. Right, so over to our next speaker, I believe.
Is that my voice echoing around the room? Oh, good. Please forgive me, I have hurt my leg, so I may do some hopping throughout this talk, but bear with me. How do I use this clicker?
It's the right side of the wheel.
This one?
Yep.
Oh, yeah. Great, so I kind of wanted to just go through just a sort of short history, if you like, of our relationship with study drugs. Because it's long and quite illustrious, you know, and sometimes we think about it as a sort of modern media scare phenomenon, but it's not. You know, we have a long history with these things. And then I just want to say a little bit about, you know, what we know about them, what we do know about them, because there's a lot we don't. And then maybe I'll just end with thinking about, you know, should we take them? So, as Caroline very clearly pointed out, caffeine, that's a study drug. That's been around for basically ever. Almost all of us have drunk that. And that is a study drug. That will, it's a stimulant that will help you study. That on the top right, those are coca leaves, and that's coca tea next to it being made. The active ingredient in that is cocaine, but if you chew them or you turn them into a tea, you kind of dampen down the effect a little bit. That bottom left is ephedra, which is a herb used in Chinese traditional medicine. That's also a stimulant. And on the right is khat, K-H-A-T, which Caroline also mentioned, which is, contains a chemical called a cathinone. And a cathinone is also a kind of stimulant. And in fact, khat, which you chew, is still given by families in the Middle East to their children before they go to school. So they chew it and they can concentrate better. So those are some of the natural study drugs which we have, which have been around in society for hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands. But we often think about study drugs as being more sort of synthetic, sort of being bad. Synthetic is bad. We all know this. Coca-Cola, the cocaine, synthetic. That's been distilled from the coca leaf. That. I was making frequent use of cocaine at that time. I had been the first to recommend the use of cocaine. In 1900, Sigmund Freud on the interpretation of dreams. So he was a fan, and lots of people were. It was a stimulant. It could help you concentrate, could help you work if you wanted to. Benzodrine has already been mentioned. That's amphetamines. So amphetamines were first found in the 1800s, but then first turned into a commercial product in the 1930s. And you could buy them as inhalers, and you would inhale them, and it was a stimulant. So that would give you pep you up. And that bottom is from a paper by Minkowski in 1939. Many students have come to cherish this drug as a gift of the gods, relying upon it to carry them through prolonged periods of cramming for examinations. So that's the first time study drugs as a sort of concept comes up in the literature. But again, still, people using study drugs, people enjoying them, working for people, really. That's Ritalin. Ritalin is one of the brand names for methylphenidate, which has been mentioned before. And in 2008, 20%, roughly, of readers of the scientific journal Nature, so you would assume they'd be mainly scientists, admitted to using some form of study drug, mainly, I think, Ritalin, although it was difficult to tell which ones they were actually using. And interestingly, in the mid-2000s, in America, the amount of children being sent to their doctors for ADHD by their parents massively increased. And then when you ask the parents about it, they often said, well, actually, we needed to level the playing field. We knew that lots of other children were taking these drugs. We needed to make sure our children had a fighting chance. And finally, modafinil, which is maybe the most recent one to come to light. It was actually made in the 1980s in a French lab, and it's an anti-narcolepsy drug. That's what it's for, medically. And that quote is from a paper in 2016 where they went around asking people who use modafinil, why do you use it, what's it like? And the quote which jumped out at me was, "It's me on a good day." So, all of these drugs have a history, and for the most part, people like it. People enjoy taking them, and they kind of recommend them. Hello, people on this side of the room. So, how do these drugs work? One of the things that we can do now, which we've not been able to do to such an extent before, is to actually interrogate them, to learn, how they function, and from that, maybe we can start to understand more about them and whether they're a good thing or a bad thing. So, any study drug is going to have an effect on your brain. It is a chemical that you ingest, and that chemical in itself will change the balance of chemicals within your brain. And the chemicals within your brain are known as neurotransmitters. So, when you take a study drug, you are changing the balance of certain neurotransmitters within your brain. And Caroline talked about this before. So the two ones, all of the study drugs that I mentioned, all of the herbal ones and all of the synthetic ones, with the exception of caffeine, they all, although caffeine does affect dopamine, they all affect dopamine, which is the chemical which drives reward in your brain, so rewards you for doing things that are good. And they increase the amount of noradrenaline, which is the attention chemical. So it makes you attend to things which are important in your environment. And all study drugs, apart from caffeine, which does, but in a slightly roundabout way, they all increase both dopamine and noradrenaline. So that's how they work. Now, if you increase the amount of dopamine and noradrenaline, these two neurotransmitters in your brain, we'll get to that in a second. Hold your horses. So, the three study drugs that I want to talk about now are the three ones which are the most sort of prevalent recently. So, no one is really taking cocaine to help them study anymore, or amphetamines, I hope. But the three big ones now are modafinil, methylphenidate, which is Ritalin, and Adderall, which is amphetamines. So, modafinil increases your dopamine a little bit. Methylphenidate increases it more, and amphetamines increase it an awful lot. So that's the difference between these three drugs. Now, what does it matter how much you increase the dopamine? Well, as you increase the dose, the following happens. Increase it a little bit, and you increase wakefulness, and you increase vigilance and attention. So when you take a modafinil, say, or a small amount of modafinil, and you increase your dopamine, then your noradrenaline a little bit, you will go into this wakefulness and vigilance column, which you could call cognitive enhancement. As you increase the dose, hyperlocomotion, maybe you want that, probably doesn't help you study, a feeling of power and mania. Now, you may find, if you ever are unfortunate enough to talk to someone who's just had a large line of cocaine, this is the kind of behavior they will show. And then a high and euphoria as you increase the amount. And then finally, if you really overdo it, psychosis, then coma, then death. But you really have to go some to get to that level. So, as you increase dopamine and noradrenaline, you move up this graph. So, that's how they work. And now we know how they work, it just helps us make a more informed decision as to whether we want to take them or not. But that graph neatly leads us on to whether they're dangerous. The more we know, the more we can work out for ourselves if they are so dangerous that we don't want to take that risk. Now, if you take a huge amount, you will go into that coma psychosis column. So let's just assume that we're not going to do that. Is there any other massive danger to these things? And I would have said that the most obvious danger is one of addiction. So when you increase the amount of dopamine artificially, if you do it quickly and you do it a lot, so there's a lot of dopamine coming into your brain very quickly, you will addict yourself to the situation and the thing that you're taking. That's, a very general rule. Amphetamines, methylphenidate, that's Adderall and Ritalin, they are chemicals which increase the amount of dopamine fast and lots, comparatively speaking. So they are addictive, and they're known to be addictive, and we know they are, which is part of the reason that they're scheduled and controlled. Modafinil is unknown whether it's addictive or not. There are reports that it is addictive. There's a case of a 23-year-old man coming off meth. He was found to get addicted to it. And there are cases of animals showing cocaine-like symptoms from it. So maybe it is. But then there are other reports that say that it can be used to treat addiction. So modafinil is we don't know whether it's addictive or not, but it's not clearly addictive in the way that those other two are. So now we know whether they're dangerous or not. We can ask the question, are they beneficial? And that really is the thing we want to know. The literature broadly agrees, and there isn't a huge amount of it because it's just not done for the most part. Certainly on modafinil, I'm going to talk about now. I'm not going to talk about methylphenidate, and I'm not going to talk about amphetamine. I'm going to talk about modafinil, this thing which is not known to be addictive. So the best one, if you want to be obtuse about it. The studies that have been done on modafinil find that it improves your learning and memory to an extent. It improves attention to a task, that's for sure. It slightly improves your executive function, so your logical ability to solve logical problems. What it does not do is increase your creativity, although people have tried to show that it does that. But these three things are pretty much accepted. So it will do those. It will improve your brain power in that respect. The other thing it does, interestingly, is it actually increases your enjoyment of the task. So it makes you want to work. It makes you enjoy it. Another interesting thing about this is that the tests themselves aren't optimized. People who do these tests to test people to see whether they're any good at these things, to see if they're attending more or learning more, often those tests are designed for people who are sub-level, who have problems doing that. So really there's a ceiling effect whereby people take those tests are actually doing so well that the test can't measure it anymore. So that's part of it. Right, so just as I come to the end, I just want to leave you with a few things. So we've talked about study drugs, and we're all going to talk about study drugs, and we're going to talk about modafinil and Ritalin and methylphenidate and all these things that improve your attention and your focus. Now, this does not do that. However, there are currently trials undergoing, or there are soon going to be trials, of using this to improve your creativity. Now, few people would think that LSD is a classic study drug, but it could be that if you microdose it, and people in Silicon Valley will swear to you that this is true, if you so take very small doses over a long period of time, it might improve your creativity. Our concept of what a study drug is could be expanded from what we currently think. So this is a man tutoring a small girl, and what this is trying to say is, yeah, study drugs give you an unfair advantage. Sure, fine, we all know that. If you take one just before an exam, you're going to have an advantage. I would say, though, that getting private tuition would also do that. And speaking as someone who has been a private tutor, I didn't really offer them any help, but you can get a huge advantage simply from having money to throw at the problem, right? So it is not as simple as saying it's cheating. There are many things which give us an advantage. And just because it gives you an advantage, I don't think that's a reason that you should automatically discount it. Just to leave it on this one. So let's say, for example, you could go in and buy some modafinil from your pharmacy, and you could take it. Now, you would be gambling a little bit, because we don't know what the long-term effects are. We don't know what it's going to do to you, really, right? We're in the dark for most of these things. But it could be an option. And there are other options, right? If you exercise, if you do brain training, if you sleep, if you play an instrument, those are ways of boosting your brain power. And they have roughly the same effect as taking study drugs. So, should it be an option? Maybe. Are there alternatives? Certainly. I'm done. That's it. That's it, Mike.
Okay, great.
Just sit there.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Thank you. Gosh, how do you follow Ray and Ali? Thank you very much. I'll try. So my name is Neil. I'm a lecturer in education at the University of Gloucestershire, and I'm a proud St George's alumni of 2009 as a biomedical scientist. Biomedical scientist, educational leadership lecturer. Not quite sure how that happened, but it did. But what I specialise in is my research is about schools and why they make the decisions that they make, and school leaders and why they make the decisions that they make. And what I hope to bring to you today is a little bit of an educational perspective around this concept of study drugs. And when I was given this kind of talk, 15 minutes, hey, talk about study drugs from an educational angle, I initially thought, what? Why would I take a study drug? And then I thought about what I understand about the educational system that we have in the United Kingdom. And some of the behaviours we already see at both the individual level and at the system level. And I think, gosh, okay, this starts to become quite, in my mind, and I was quite shocked. I was like, this becomes quite a reasonable thing. When we see it from the perspective of what is asked of students and what is asked of schools. And then it becomes an extension of what is already happening within the system. And some of the points which Ali raised in terms of tuition that I will talk about as well. And so what I'm going to present to you today is the notion that potentially the taking of study drugs as a concept, as an idea, is both rational, in that there could be a logic to it, and an extension of what we already see at the individual level and at the system level. So, the first thing I want to talk about is why could this be seen as something relatively rational or logical? The first thing is, on an individual level, children at GCSE and A-level compete. A GCSE and an A-level grade is not an absolute descriptor of what that person can do. It's what that person can do in relation to their peers. The grade tells you how well they've done in relation to their peers. So how well the cohort does will determine and affect how well you do. 30 to 33% of students have to fail. Not could. They have to fail. Why? Because that's how GCSEs and A-levels are built. Not everyone can pass. Some have to fail. And if we look at the pass marks, that went a bit far. There we go. It stays roughly, to get a good grade, which is grade 4 and above at GCSE, stays roughly around 70%. So around 70% of people will get a grade 4 and above. And we can see that consistently across 2014, 15, 16, 17, and 18. So that means the other 30% have to fail, and GCSEs are built that way. So it's important to note that a GCSE and A-level grade doesn't just tell a student how well they've done in relation to their peers. So students are competing. It's not like A-level degree level, where the grade boundaries shift according to how well everyone is done. At GCSE and A-level, the grade boundaries shift every year according to how well the cohort's done. So that's really important. Individuals are competing. And then we look at a school level. Not only are individuals competing within themselves within the system, schools are competing within themselves within the system. Parents have a choice. They can choose to send their child to a school within a particular catchment. And consequently, we can see this is an excerpt. This sheet here is something everyone can get access to. You can go on to the DFE's website, Department for Education, and you can find the outcomes for every school. You can find outcomes. You can find out about progress, how students do when they come in compared to how well they come out. You can see how well they do compared on free school meals, special educational needs, how well they do compared to their to both schools within the local authority and nationally. So this is an example of a rural school in England. You can see in this school, in terms of pupils meeting expected standard in reading, writing and maths, you can compare the school to the local authority average and to the England average. And you can see their progress overall. There's a fixed number of students. Parents have choice. How many you have on your roll determines your funding for that year. So schools are competing for the same pool of students. And interestingly, there is strong links between how strong your cohort is and the outcomes that are obtained. So it becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. Your school wants to recruit well because that means you're more likely to have good outcomes. And by having good outcomes, parents are more likely to choose your school. It becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. So while schools are being encouraged to work together, they are competing on a fundamental level for students. So not only is there competition within the individual level, there's competition at the school level as well. Okay? So the question I raised there is, when a system is set to compete, surely people will look for whatever advantage they can grab. And we know this. So Stephen Ball talks about how the effect of performativity, so getting schools to perform, and how that affects how schools make decisions. We know that how operating within a market, i.e. people having choice, can force some organizations to make unethical decisions. So Scheffler talks about this idea of conduct being described as unethical as a consequence of competition, how such pressure can lead to censored behavior, such as adjusting prices or price gaming, or whether or not they should hire, so one of the examples he uses is child labor, and how competition can drive some companies to do that. So I therefore propose that study drugs, in the face of such competition with high stakes, GCSE and A-levels really do matter. And student role really does matter to a school. When faced with such high stakes, does it scarily, it may be scarily, not to judge, but we look at that and we go, gosh, actually, could we begin to understand why someone might make this decision? That it's not an irrational, dangerous decision, but actually one that some people might make rationally. And it becomes a rational choice because of what the system demands on both the individual, but also schools as well. But then we have to look at what behaviours we already see within the education system to see that this is, if the study drugs phenomenon is growing, that is not an isolated behaviour. There are many examples on the individual and system level of schools and individuals trying to get ahead, trying to take an advantage. And these are said without judgment. So on an individual level, almost 1 in 3 parents, so this was a report done by the Sutton Trust, which is a charity which explores the link between education and social disadvantage. In a recent report called Parent Power, 1 in 3 parents knew of a parent who had used ethically dubious strategies to secure a good place for their child. This might include using the grandparents' address that was in the school's catchment area. It would include parents going to religious ceremonies so they could secure their child a place in a school of religious character and then never to go again. It also included parents that rented a home within the catchment only for once the place had been allocated for them to give up the home. Job done. 1 in 3 parents could identify another parent that engaged in that. And I'm hearing the muttering and the nodding of heads. You can probably all identify with that too, right? Private tuition. Massive increases in private tuition. So In 1 year alone, between 2017 and 2018, in the UK, we have some areas have grammar schools, and that has an 11+ exam entrance system, has seen a 10% increase in parents obtaining private tuition at the 11+ stage. And now 31% of parents from professional backgrounds are investing in private tuition at the GCSE stage. Note, for children with free school meals, it's 6%. Just 6%. And that's gone up from 25% in 2017 to 18% and 18% in 2005. So it is just going up and up and up. So on an individual level, we are seeing people trying to get ahead, find a way to take an advantage. And there's no judgment in that because they recognise that this is a competitive system. But schools as well are engaging in this. And again, this is not from a judgmental perspective. The system's asking them to compete. And so schools, recently you would have heard in the media about this concept of off-rolling. Okay? And DFE released a paper today as well, which was looking at this concept of off-rolling. And off-rolling is the use of informal exclusion by schools to make sure that child does not affect the end exam result for that school. Okay, so according to Education Data Lab, of the 22,000 children that left state education by the end of year 11, 7,000 are unaccounted for. We don't know where those 7,000 have gone. They did not finish their education. They did not leave with GCSEs. And you can guess which groups are in there. Children with special educational needs, children from free school meal backgrounds. So they are the ones being put into this 7,000 group. Ofsted have stated they've got concerns over this practice, that it's becoming a wider thing. 560 schools have a significantly above expectation for moving students on. 560 schools. Okay? And 21% of teachers within schools could identify this behaviour within their own school. 21% of teachers. Okay? And there's this anecdotal evidence of schools gaming league tables. So some of these behaviours you might have seen, what we called exam qualification cat and mouse, which was the DFE would introduce a change to how the league tables worked, and schools would try to respond. So the GCSE in English for speaking English was removed, and so schools moved to the IGCSE because it started speaking and listening in. And then that was removed, and this year the people who write the IGCSE curriculums are no longer going to be writing it for English state schools. Funny enough, the interest in it dropped the moment that they were pulled away from the league table. Double entry of students into exams, so students being entered twice for exams, and again I'm seeing some nodding heads. Yep, I've seen that. And the abuse of technical and vocational qualifications being used to artificially increase school league table results. And again, I do not say any of this with judgment. I say this with, these are behaviours that people are recognising on the ground, motivated by trying to get a competitive edge in the league tables. Why? Because it helps with recruitment, helps get Ofsted off their back. If a school goes into requires improvement, they've got 2 years to turn it around. And that 2 years isn't hands off. That is intense monitoring throughout those 2 years. And so this question I ask is, within this set of behaviours, does a study drug look particularly out of place? On an individual level, we can see people trying to take an advantage from age 5 through to age 16. And so we risk judging the taking of a study drug as irrational, irresponsible. I'm not here to judge whether we should or should not. I'm just here to ask the question, to ask some empathy here, in terms of, without assessing the wider context, we risk making this judgment too early. And that we neglect that human behaviour is a consequence of what happens when individuals and contexts collide. That's the result of behavior. Behavior comes from when individuals and sense-making collide with how society expects us to behave. It ignores that the current educational context promotes competition at the individual level. Ignores how aforementioned behaviors have emerged because they have a function. So all these behaviors haven't emerged because of anything except they meet a need. Individuals are trying to get their child into a good school place. Why? Because it meets a need. Schools are engaging in off-rolling. Some schools are engaging in off-rolling. Why? Because it meets a need. It's rational. It helps them survive. And it ignores that individuals and schools are already trying to gain some form of advantage. And so why should the taking of a study drug be treated any different to these aforementioned behaviors? Because the root behind it is the same. The reason behind it is the same. And so what should we do? So I've got some points for you to go and think about. First of all, we should look to empathize and understand the context around a phenomenon. Behavior emerges when individuals and context collide. It isn't one or the other, it's both. That's why behavior is so complex. So we should look to empathize and understand the context around an individual choice or a behavior within a system. To what gain is a system that uses mechanisms of competition? So we need to ask that wider question of, does a GCSE need to be relative to each other's performance, or can we actually measure absolute performance instead? And what children are more vulnerable to these particular types of behaviors? There will be some children and some adults who take a study drug. There will be some presented with the same context who choose not to. We need to understand both groups. We need to understand what would drive, not judge, but understand what would drive some to take without judgment and what would drive others to not take, because it's the same contextual cue, just people responding differently. So I hope those questions give you something to think about. And thank you for your attention, for listening. Thank you very much. And